Hi, guys. We are continuing our talk on mental health topics, and we covered several mental health disorders already. Go back and review those if you don't remember very much. One of the things we're specifically going to talk about today refers to disorders that happen as a result of trauma. So, trauma is the topic we're covering today, but it also is affected by other things like panic, and you can cope with trauma using some of the techniques I've already talked to you about panic attacks, how to cope with those. Trauma can cause depression. We're going to talk about that later. So this is kind of a continuation on our mental health section, looking at one of the root causes for a lot of mental health disorders. So the first thing we're going to talk about is what is trauma. So a little bit later on, I'm going to differentiate between big T trauma and little t trauma. So big T trauma, the definition is trauma is the response, so it's a person's response to a deeply distressing or disturbing event. And it overwhelms the individual's ability to cope, causes feelings of helplessness, diminishes a person's sense of self, their identity, who they are, and impairs their ability to feel a normal human range of emotions and experiences. A lot of this might seem pretty obvious if you think about big T traumas like being caught in a mass shooting, for example. One of my neighbors growing up, my little brother's friend, he and his friends were in Las Vegas celebrating a marriage of another friend of theirs, and they ended up at the concert where the Las Vegas shooter went crazy and started firing on all these people at a concert and killed a lot of people. And my neighbor, the girl who was getting married, was actually one of the people killed during the attack. And so he and, of course, her fiance, they tried to save her. They couldn't get her to a hospital in time. She died. As you can imagine, this is a big T trauma. Having someone literally shoot on you and then watching your good friend die in front of you. This is a big T trauma. So that's something we're going to talk about, big T's. It's overwhelming, deeply distressing, deeply disturbing. Now, small t's, again, are also going to cause a lot of the similar feelings, but they're not going to be as shocking or life-changing kind of events. These are going to be maybe your parents lose their jobs and you have to move and change states, and everything you've known, everyone you've known, you get ripped out of your normal life and you have to start over. That's a small T trauma. What we're not trying to make that to be small, because that's a very big trauma to a person, but it's not quite in the same categories like acts of war. And so they're both deeply distressing. They both, whatever range of trauma you're experiencing, can diminish people's sense of self, cause feelings of helplessness, etc. Circumstances around trauma, generally speaking, involve these things: the loss of control. People usually not as traumatized when they are in power over their circumstances. So a traumatic circumstance almost always implies the loss of the person's control. Betrayal, that can be extremely traumatic. Abuse of power, for example, if someone that you know is abusing you and they have power over you and you can't do anything about it because of the power they have over you, that would be intensely traumatic and would involve an abuse of power on their part and you being a victim on your part. Also deep feelings of helplessness and anger, of course, because of that helplessness. Pain and confusion and loss, you can imagine these are very much always going to be present in any kind of trauma. So this is kind of a sad topic today. I think I was considering skipping over this lesson and the next one for our mental health. The next one's going to be on self-harm and suicide. But I've decided that it's important for you guys to be educated about these things and how to cope with them, because currently in the world right now, having a global quarantine being implied and not implied, exerted over everyone, and being stuck at home and losing out on things for the high school seniors, for example, losing out on prom and all the graduation ceremonies. This is a small t trauma. It's not really the end of the world for people, but it is a trauma, and it does seriously affect people. And the repercussions of what's happening in the world can cause long-term negative repercussions for people. So I decided to go ahead and keep this lesson in. I hope you guys managed to make it to the end, where I talk about the things you can do, because you are not helpless. There are things you can do to cope with trauma. Okay? So one of the things to talk about is that no matter what the event is that caused the trauma, each person individually is going to react differently to that event. So depending on how helpless they felt, depending on their past, depending on all kinds of factors, it's very subjective. So what that means is that it is a person-to-person difference in the levels of being traumatized. One story that I told my students before was, my mother is a retired woman. She rents out a room or two in her house to people. And last year before, one of the people she rented a room out to was a young guy from the South, and this is in California I'm talking about. And he was young and naive, and he came to Los Angeles, where my mom lives, and he did not understand certain things about not hanging out with the wrong crowd. He had not experienced the wrong crowd in the southern kind of protected upbringing he had. And so he got in with the wrong crowd, and they were sitting in his room, he and these people, two other guys, and they decided to play with guns. I don't know exactly the details of what happened, but my mom's tenant had fallen asleep, and one of the two guys in his room had his brains blown out by the other guy. And I believe it was deemed to be an accident. They were just playing around with the guns. I'm not sure how you can accidentally blow someone's brains out, but anyways, so my mom, being the owner of the house, and obviously gunfire and police coming and, all of these things happening, this would be a very traumatic thing. And so the police officer was talking to my mom afterwards, and he said, so you don't seem too upset, what you don't seem to be losing it as much. And she said, well, I used to, when I was married to my first husband, we ran guns as civilians in the Vietnam War. And so we had to deal with things like throwing grenades over the side of the boat because people were trying to bomb our boat. And the guy said, okay, that makes sense. Because the reason why I'm telling that story is that for people who have learned in the past to cope with traumatic experiences, firefighters, police officers, EMT, soldiers, the same event might not be as traumatizing to them as it would be to someone else. So, for example, my mom was not as traumatized by this murder that happened or accidental murder that happened in her house as your average, 70-something woman, because she had already had a life that had given her some very traumatic experiences. One person's worst night of their life could be a police officer's fairly quiet night on the job. So that's important to understand, that the way the event affects you depends a lot on your past, what you have had to learn to cope with. Okay, so trauma and to get to this point is you need to remember that it is defined more by its response than its trigger. So that's what that means. So for one person, an event could be very traumatic, and for another person it could be not really a big deal. And that's because each person has their own set of adaptive responses to life events. And so it's not invalidating one person's intense trauma from a smaller event. For example, not being able to go to prom. That could be intensely traumatizing to someone. And that's valid. That's okay. It might be the worst thing that's ever happened to them. Someone else might have grown up in a very abusive home and, not being able to go to what was basically a party might not bother them at all. Depends on your life experiences. So each of us have our own life experiences. Nobody else has lived the life we have. And so we can each bear in mind that give each other's grace. What might be traumatizing to that person might not be traumatizing to you. If someone had a phobia of a spider, for example, and someone dropped a spider on their head, it could be intensely traumatizing. But if you don't have any fear of spiders, you might be like, oh, that's a funny joke. It's not a joke to the person who is literally, in fear for their lives, and they're dealing with this trigger and everything. So each of us needs to remember that everybody's trauma is personal to them. Okay? So let's keep going. One thing I wanted to talk about was the connection between trauma and stress. So we talked about stress before, and we said stress is anything that life brings our way that has the potential to upset us, to upset our balance, to, we talked about the stress hormone cortisol. We talked about the, just getting out of bed is stressful, and then being told you have an assignment due tomorrow and you haven't even started it. That's stressful. There's certain things that happen in our lives that are stressful, so we call those stressors. So if you think about a traumatic event, for example, my neighbor's experience of the shooting in Las Vegas, that experience was most definitely stressful. But a stressor does not always cause trauma. It's not always traumatic. You guys understand the difference there? It's always going to be stressful experiencing something that causes trauma, but it's not always going to be traumatizing to experience something causes stress. For example, you might be stressed about taking the AP history class, but you're not traumatized by it. You're not indelibly injured to your personhood. So stress is not always harmful. We talked about that, there being so-called good stress that gets you out of bed in the morning. But trauma is always harmful. So let's talk about trauma with a small t. Small t trauma is where your bodily safety or life is not threatened, but it still causes you symptoms of trauma. So it could be moving. It could be having to live at home in a quarantine. It could be, for a married couple, being cheated on. Those are traumatic experiences. They are going to cause harm. They engender a feeling of helplessness. They engender a feeling of loss of control, of pain, of betrayal. These things are very much going to be problems, and you are going to have a hard time dealing with them. But it's a small t trauma because your life's not in danger or your body's safety. For example, do you think being raped would be a small t or a big T trauma? Well, I hope you said big T, because that's dealing with your body safety. So if your bodily safety is being harmed, as in the act of rape, you are dealing with a big T trauma. Okay? Small t means your life is not being threatened and your bodily safety is not being threatened. So most people have an easier time recovering from small t traumas. However, one of the things about this crazy life we live is that sometimes things just keep coming at us. For example, you might be able to, deal with a life-changing event like having to move. But if you had to deal with that small t trauma and the loss of a family member and the feeling of betrayal by a good friend and, you can think of all these so-called small t traumas, financial troubles, work stress, legal battles, all of these things are traumatic. And if they all happen very close together, they start snowballing. If you add them all up, the cumulative effect of all that trauma can turn it into, experientially, the same problem as a big T trauma. So you need to remember that although you may not have experienced, having your friend murdered in front of you, it is still possible for you to experience some small t traumas all together that end up affecting you as much as a big T trauma. So the cumulative effect can be problematic. Now, trauma with a large T, so this is going to be or big T. These are extraordinary experiences that bring about severe distress and helplessness. So the Las Vegas shootings obviously would be an act of domestic terrorism, sexual assault, like I mentioned, rape, natural catastrophes, being in the middle of a hurricane or tornado. These are very extraordinary. They're not part of your normal life, and they are very distressing and cause a lot of trauma. Also, one thing to note is that certain things that happen over time, like child abuse or neglect or violence, these things, if there are, enough of them in a row, they become basically big T trauma. So there's something called complex PTSD. I'll talk about PTSD in a couple minutes. And complex PTSD is very common in survivors of abuse and survivors of warfare, survivors of neglect, because the cumulative effect created a big T trauma experience. So large T traumas are difficult or even impossible to overlook. What that means is you can't pretend it didn't happen. But what most people do is they just bury it deep down inside, and they actively avoid certain places that might remind them, certain people. I don't think my neighbor has gone to a concert since the Las Vegas shooting. You basically were very, very disturbed and upset and damaged by whatever happened during this large T trauma, that you prolong any reminder that might bring you back to where you felt those horrible feelings of helplessness. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that long. Always. You can shove everything under the rug, but the more you shove under there, the rug just keeps getting bigger and bigger, right? Because things don't go away when they get shoved under a rug. If you shove a box under a rug and then another box and another box, eventually you can't walk over that rug anymore. It's this giant lump in your life. And this is what happens to people who get traumatized. If they don't deal with the trauma, they have it burst out in other ways, and we'll talk about that in some of those ways. So common responses and symptoms to any kind of trauma. Okay, obviously you're going to be feeling a lot of different feelings. Sadness, anger, denial, fear, shame. This is just an example of some of the emotions you could be feeling. We are complicated creatures. We are able to feel a wide range of emotions, and those are all going to come into play during a traumatic event. What happens is if you have experienced this traumatic event and you are dealing with it or not dealing with it so well, you can try to push it down and keep going day to day. This is something that a lot of police officers do, for example, or soldiers. But eventually, your brain does start working on it. So you get nightmares. You can shove it down out of your conscious mind all day long, but you can't shove it out of your mind completely. And so you get these nightmares happening. Recurring nightmares is a very common side effect of trauma. You might not want to go to sleep at all because of the nightmares. And so you can't sleep because you might want to sleep. You might feel so tired. You think, I'm just desperate for some sleep. And then you fall asleep and the nightmares are so bad. You're like, oh, I don't want to do that again. Obviously, if you're not sleeping very well, things have been happening in your life that are leading you to these problems. You're going to have difficulty in relationships. Sleep deprivation causes a wide range of mental side effects, including up to hallucinations and, developing some mental problems. So that's going to have more cause for difficulty with relationships. You remember we talked about the anger iceberg. Trauma is a huge creator of iceberg issues. It's going to make you feel all the power of helplessness and loss of control and betrayal and anger and loss and all that, and will explode out eventually, somehow. All right, so physically, some people have more physical symptoms than others, but these are the common ones. This is commonly how people start experiencing the side effects. You might be really good at shoving things deep, deep down inside, but you can't change the fact that you are having stomach problems. A lot of children, for example, one of the ways that they detect problems in children's lives is children might begin complaining of stomach aches. And the stomach aches are just a symptom of some really big stuff that's going on inside of them. So nausea, stomach aches, you could feel dizzy, you can have headaches. Again, altered sleep patterns, that's pretty obvious. If you don't want to go to sleep or you want to sleep all the time, that's going to include the nightmares we talked about. Changes in appetite, you might be starving and then you can't eat for 2 weeks. These kind of things. I had a life experience when I was living abroad that was very traumatic. And I literally couldn't eat more than half of a piece of bread a day, all for over a week and a half. And I lost about 15 pounds in that week. And generally speaking, if you're going on a diet, you're only supposed to lose about 1 or 2 pounds a week. And I basically was like starving to death because I couldn't eat. So I know personally, change of appetite, this literally makes it so you cannot eat. And that's dangerous, especially if you don't have a lot of extra fat on your body to spare. Gastrointestinal problems. This is some people. This comes out. I know somebody who every time he gets a little stressed, he starts having diarrhea. Just goes straight to his stomach, starts having diarrhea. And then nervous tics. I want to explain that a little bit because I think some of you might have one. So a nervous tic is where a nerve starts discharging somewhere. Usually it happens on your face, but it doesn't always. And it just starts randomly seemingly happening. So I had this happen to me when my family was where we were living. We had to get evacuated because there was forest fire coming for our house. And then this happened a few days after we lost our baby, and the cumulative effect of it was very traumatic. And so my face, I had this nerve near my eye that just started twitching all the time. And it was really bothersome, and I had no idea why until I finally realized it was a nervous tic I had developed because of the stress. One of the first signs you might have that you're getting really stressed is a nervous tic, a twitch. Some muscle just starts and you're not doing it, but it's just doing it by itself. So if you have something like that happening, then you need to look at your stress and maybe start talking to your friends and family about how can I reduce my stress. Go for walks, journal. Talk about some of the coping techniques we talked about with stress. So the physical impact of trauma, this is something I'm going to leave for you guys to read if you want a little bit more. But when a child is growing up and they experience trauma as a young child, it actually affects how their body develops. We mentioned this in another lesson. Neurotransmitters start changing in the brain. Pathways begin to rewire to cope with the trauma. What that means is that there are side effects, mental side effects, that you're going to need professional help to get over, because you literally have to rewire your brain once it has been traumatized. So children who have been abused, this is something that they have to deal with. It's a terrible thing, but it's part of this messed up world we live in, that sometimes bad things happen to people, and so they need help. So there's several ways that you can get help. There's all kinds of different treatments that can help rewire the brain. If you guys have any questions about that, let me know. Okay, now psychological disorders. We've already covered two of the disorders we've covered. Dissociative disorders and PTSD require trauma. People don't get those without trauma. If you've experienced trauma, it's very likely you will then experience afterwards anxiety, depression, panic attacks, eating disorders, substance abuse, addiction. These are all ways, they're unhealthy ways that people use or experience to try to cope with the trauma they've experienced. And it's not a good thing, but it is what it is. So once you have developed a disorder after a traumatic event, you're going to need real help to get through it. Don't think you can just power through it by yourself. Because the reason why is your brain is damaged during trauma. Literally. Your brain is damaged. And so you need help. You need personal help, and you sometimes might need chemical help to help your brain heal from the trauma that you've experienced. One of the things I mentioned in the addictions class is I said that, not the addictions class, sorry, the mental disorders class, as I said that there are drugs that help with these symptoms, but they do not cure a disease. But you know what? Sometimes having help with that symptom is really important. And so antidepressants have been shown to help people who've experienced trauma. It actually helps reset the brain and allows it to start the healing path. So those can be very important parts of a healing path forward. Now, we're going to talk really quick about acute stress disorder. So basically, you've been traumatized. You start experiencing nightmares, trouble sleeping, etc., etc. If these symptoms last less than a month, you've experienced acute stress disorder. Okay, so that's the name. It's like you got really messed up, but it's less than a month. If the symptoms go on more than a month, the name of your disorder now changes to PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome. And so some symptoms of PTSD are intrusive thoughts. Okay, remember I said your brain changes? Sometimes you can't control what you're thinking about. You have flashbacks, nightmares, and sleep disturbances, changes in memory and concentration, startle responses. Hyperarousal means it's difficult to relax. I've heard of veterans who come back from warfare. Sometimes they have very high rates of divorce afterwards, because one of the things for PTSD is people develop reactions, startle responses that can be dangerous. So I know I've talked to one woman who, her husband, when he came back from the war, if she woke him up accidentally from a deep sleep, he actually responded by trying to strangle her. That was a response he learned during warfare. Very negative reaction, obviously, in peacetime. You don't want to be strangling your wife. If you're living in a war zone, strangling a person who comes up to you when you're sleeping might actually save your life. And if you're living with your wife at home, strangling your wife, if she turns over in bed, really bad. Okay? So PTSD is very dangerous for the person and sometimes to the people around them because of these unintentioned startle responses. So people with PTSD, there's no telling when these symptoms start. Might start right away, might not start for months, might not even start for years. There's a lot that's being understood about PTSD because basically any soldier that goes away to war comes back traumatized with some kind of form of PTSD. It's just a fact of war. And so they've been studying PTSD now with all these returning soldiers, and they're discovering a lot about it. You guys can look at this up more if you like. Symptoms of PTSD that's not treated and not helped are panic attacks, depression, suicidal thoughts and feelings, drug abuse, feelings of being isolated, and not being able to complete daily tasks. And so the suicidal thoughts and feelings, we're going to talk about that with the next lesson. This is going to be very significant for why depression, PTSD is so dangerous, because it often leads to suicide, unfortunately. Okay, finally, how do you cope with trauma? Unfortunately, you have to, there's no skipping over the valley to get to the mountain. You have to walk through the valley. So if you've experienced a trauma, you have to work through it. You can't just go around it, can't go under it, can't go over it. You have to go through it. So there are several ways that you can get help going through it. You can have a counselor who does talk therapy and helps you talk through some of your experiences. Trauma-informed therapy is very important for people who have suffered really big stuff, like child abuse or warfare. Writing things out can be very helpful. Talking things out, and then therapy animals. This is where you have your actual service dogs. Not emotional support animals, but your actual trained service dogs. One of the side effects of PTSD is that sometimes a trigger can hit you and you get a flashback and you actually start thinking you're back in a situation you used to be. So, for example, some service animals, some service dogs are trained to recognize when their person has gone into a state like this. And it's very dangerous because, for example, soldiers who go into this state, they can walk into oncoming traffic without knowing where they are. And so service dogs for people like that actually are trained to keep them out of traffic. The dog recognizes when the owner has gone into a state and keeps and physically blocks the owner from moving into traffic or doing something, wrong or crazy. And then also therapy animals can be very helpful for grounding. You don't have to have an animal, but animals tend to be very present, and they're very helpful just for the fact that they help you be in the present as well. And that's very important for panic attacks. Remember, we talked about panic attacks. It's your brain lying to you, saying that your life's in danger. Your life might not actually be in danger. And so what you have to do is tell yourself the truth. My life is not in danger. My feelings are valid, but they're not true right now. And so that's why you have the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 grounding. 5 things you can look at in your surroundings. Ground yourself. See where you are. Remind yourself of what's actually happening in the present. And so that's some ways that you can cope with trauma. Okay, thanks for listening, and I hope you guys learned something. If you have any questions, let me know. Thanks.